If you could freeze time in 1965, specifically inside the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, you would see the perfect snapshot of the American century. The air is not just air, it is a visible suspension of cigarette smoke, expensive perfume, and the golden haze of stage lights that turn dust motes into diamonds. The room is packed with men in sharkskin suits who smell of Old Spice and power, and women with beehive hairdos who smell of hairspray and hope. They are all looking in one direction. They are looking at the man in the tuxedo. Dean Martin stands at the center of the universe. He is leaning against the grand piano as if it's the only thing keeping him upright. His tie is loosened just enough to suggest a long night, but not enough to look messy. In his right hand, the holy grail of the Rat Pack era, a heavy crystal tumbler, sweating with condensation, filled with amber liquid and ice. He takes a sip, grimaces, and the crowd roars with laughter. He slurs a word, stumbles slightly, and flicks a cigarette ash onto the stage floor with a disregard that screams royalty. To the millions watching on television and the hundreds in the room, this is Dean Martin, the drunk, the playboy, the man who doesn't give a damn. But look closer. Zoom in past the spotlight, past the makeup, right into the eyes. They are dark, hooded, and terrifyingly alert. While his body plays the part of the intoxicated clown, his mind is counting the house, checking the exits, and calculating the exact second he can leave. And that glass in his hand? The symbol of his debauchery? It's apple juice. It has always been apple juice. This is the greatest magic trick in the history of show business. Dean Martin built a legend on a liquid lie, convincing the world he was having the time of his life, while in reality, he was the loneliest man in the room, desperate for the silence of his own bed. This is not a story about a party that never ended. This is the story of the man who wanted to go home. Before the tuxedo, there was the soot. Before the Sands Hotel, there was Steubenville, Ohio. If you haven't been there, you can't understand the texture of the place in the 1920s. It was a town that chewed men up and spat them out. The sky was permanently gray, stained by the steel mills that lined the Ohio River like fire-breathing dragons. It was a town of immigrants, hard men with calloused hands and broken English, who worked 12-hour shifts in temperatures that would melt rubber. Dino Crocetti was born into this industrial grinder. He didn't speak a word of English until he was 5 years old. In the schoolyard, this made him a target. He learned early that words were dangerous, that speaking up only got you hit. So, he learned to be quiet. He learned to watch. He saw his father, Gaetano, a barber who spent his life trimming the hair of men who were too tired to talk. He saw the future that Steubenville offered, the mill, the bar, the grave. And Dino, even as a child, made a silent vow that echoed in his bones, not me. He tried to fight his way out. He dropped out of school in the 10th grade because algebra couldn't teach you how to survive a street fight. He entered the boxing ring under the name Kid Crochet. It sounds romantic now, in the sepia-toned retrospectives, but the reality was the metallic taste of blood and the smell of stale sweat. He was a welterweight, fighting for a few dollars a night in smoky basements where the spectators wanted to see pain. He broke his knuckles. He broke his nose, a jagged break that he would carry for years before Hollywood surgeons chiseled it into perfection. But the ring taught him a crucial lesson, one that would define his stage persona later: conservation of energy. In the ring, if you swing wild, you get tired, and if you get tired, you get knocked out. You have to be cool. You have to wait. You have to let the other guy make the mistake. Dino carried this counterpuncher mentality from the boxing ring to the nightclub. He never chased the audience, he let them come to him. But getting punched in the face for $10 wasn't a sustainable career. Dino was handsome, in a dark, brooding way, and he had hands that were quicker than his feet. He found his way into the backrooms of Steubenville cigar shops, which were fronts for illegal gambling dens. Here, Dino Crocetti found his true education. He became a croupier. He dealt blackjack, he worked the craps tables. This is where the Dean Martin mask was truly forged. Think about the job of a dealer. You are standing in the center of the action, handling thousands of dollars, surrounded by gangsters, drunks, and desperate men who have just lost their rent money. The air is thick with tension. If you show fear, they eat you alive. If you show arrogance, they shoot you. You have to be a stone. You have to be cool. Dino perfected the hooded gaze, the slow movement of the hands, the half-smile that said, "I know something you don't." He learned to be charming without being intimate. He learned to make a man feel good about losing his money. This detachment, this ability to be in the chaotic center of the room while remaining emotionally untouched, was the superpower that would one day conquer Hollywood. He started singing almost by accident, humming along with the records of Bing Crosby and the Mills Brothers. He realized that holding a microphone was easier than holding a shovel or a deck of cards. He had a voice, a rich, warm baritone that sounded like melted chocolate. It wasn't the best voice in the world, it didn't have the operatic range of Sinatra. But it had texture. It sounded like a friend telling you a secret. He started singing in local clubs, changing his name to Dino Martini, and then, finally, Dean Martin. He was trying to sound American. He was trying to scrub off the coal dust. But the weariness remained. Even when he sang upbeat songs, there was a shadow in his voice, a hint of the Steubenville blues that he could never quite shake. New York City. The war was over, and the world was hungry for laughter. Dean was struggling. He was a good-looking crooner, in a sea of good-looking crooners. He was playing the 500 Club in Atlantic City, a mob-run joint where the owner, Skinny D'Amato, was threatening to fire him because the act was boring. "You sing nice, kid," Skinny told him, "but nice don't sell whiskey." Enter the chaos. Jerry Lewis. He was barely 20, a manic stick figure of a human being with a screeching voice and a face made of rubber. He was playing the same club, doing a record act, mugging along to phonograph tracks. He was everything Dean was not: loud, needy, explosive, and desperate for attention. They were oil and water. They shouldn't have worked. But faced with unemployment, Skinny gave them an ultimatum: go out there together and do something, or you're both fired. July 25, 1946. The night comedy changed forever. They had no script. They had no rehearsal. Dean went out to sing a ballad, and Jerry, dressed in a busboy's uniform, dropped a tray of dishes. The audience gasped. Dean didn't get angry, he looked at the shattered plates, looked at Jerry, and then looked at the audience with that dealer's deadpan stare. He flicked his cigarette ash on Jerry's head. The room exploded. It wasn't just funny, it was primal. For the next 10 years, Martin and Lewis were not just a comedy team, they were a force of nature. They were the Beatles before the Beatles. They caused riots in Times Square. Women fainted. Men laughed until they required medical attention. The dynamic was perfect, the handsome man and the monkey. Sex and anarchy. Dean was the solid earth, and Jerry was the hurricane. But watch the old footage. Really watch it. Everyone looks at Jerry jumping around, cutting ties, spraying seltzer water. But the genius is Dean. Dean is the anchor. Without Dean standing perfectly still, reacting with that microscopic raise of an eyebrow, Jerry is just noise. Dean gave Jerry the context to be funny. He allowed himself to be interrupted, to be mocked, to be the butt of the joke, night after night. He suppressed his own ego to feed the monster of their success. But monsters have big appetites, and eventually, this one would try to eat him whole. Fame is a magnifying glass. It takes the tiny cracks in a relationship and widens them into canyons. By the mid-1950s, Martin and Lewis were the biggest stars in the world, but they couldn't stand to be in the same room. The narrative in the press was poison: Jerry is the genius, Dean is the stooge. Jerry writes the jokes, Dean just stands there. Dean Martin, the kid who fought in prize rings and dealt to gangsters, was being called a coat rack. A prop. The disrespect ate at him like acid. He knew he was the timing, the rhythm, the straight man who made the punchline land. But Jerry began to believe his own press. He became controlling, obsessive, a tyrant on the movie sets. Dean withdrew. He went back to his default setting, silence. He would arrive on set, do his lines, and retreat to his dressing room to practice his golf swing. He checked out emotionally years before they officially broke up. The end came in 1956, at the Copa Room, the very place where they had reigned as kings. The final show. The air was so cold you could see your breath. They didn't speak off stage. On stage, the chemistry was curdled, toxic. When the final curtain fell, Dean didn't look back. He didn't say goodbye. He walked out the back door, got into his car, and drove away. The media wrote his obituary the next morning. Dean Martin is dead, they said. Without Jerry, he's nothing. They predicted he would be playing dive bars in 6 months. They forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot about the poker face. Dean read the papers, poured a drink, a real one, and smiled. He was finally free. And he was about to prove everyone wrong. The reinvention of Dean Martin is one of the greatest comebacks in Hollywood history. He didn't just survive, he evolved. He took the cool persona he had been refining in the background and brought it front and center. He released Memories Are Made of This, and it went to #1. He took serious acting roles, The Young Lions, Rio Bravo, and stood toe-to-toe with Marlon Brando and John Wayne. The critics were stunned. The drunk can act, they whispered. But the final piece of the puzzle was a man named Frank. Frank Sinatra needed Dean Martin. Frank was the chairman of the board, the volatility, the danger. He needed a vice president. He needed someone who could stand next to him and not be intimidated. Dean was the only man on earth who didn't care about Frank Sinatra's power. When Frank yelled, Dean laughed. When Frank demanded loyalty, Dean offered company, but on his own terms. The Rat Pack was born. It wasn't a formal group, it was a vibe. A lifestyle. Frank, Dean, Sammy, Peter, Joey. They took over Las Vegas. They filmed Ocean's 11 during the day and played the Sands at night. It was the summit of cool. But the dynamic was fascinating. Frank was the leader, the alpha male who directed the traffic. But Dean? Dean was the one everyone wanted to be. Frank was trying too hard, you could see the effort in his veins. Dean made it look like he woke up in a tuxedo. There is a famous story from this era. The Rat Pack is on stage, mid-show. Frank is ranting about something, commanding the stage, his ego filling the room. Dean walks over to the bar cart, pours a drink, looks at Frank, and says into the microphone, "You know, Frank, you're a hell of a singer, but you talk too much." The audience freezes. Nobody talks to Sinatra like that. Frank looks at Dean, sees the flat, fearless eyes of the croupier from Steubenville, and he laughs. He has to laugh. Because Dean is the only one who doesn't need him. And that made Dean the most powerful man in the room. By 1965, the cultural landscape of America was shifting beneath everyone's feet. The Beatles had landed, bringing with them a tidal wave of long hair, electric guitars, and youthful rebellion. Old Hollywood was dying. The crooners were fading, dismissed as dinosaurs by a generation that wanted rock and roll. But then, something impossible happened. In the middle of Beatlemania, a 48-year-old man in a tuxedo, holding a cigarette and singing a slow, sentimental ballad called "Everybody Loves Somebody," knocked the Beatles off the top of the Billboard charts. It was an anomaly. It was Dean Martin saying, "Not yet, kids." NBC saw the power of this anomaly. They offered him a television show. But Dean didn't want a show. He didn't want the work. He wanted to play golf. He wanted to watch westerns. So, he gave them a list of demands designed to make them say no. He demanded a salary that was unheard of. He demanded that he would not rehearse. Not a single day. He would show up on the day of taping, read the script for the first time on cue cards, do the show, and go home. He demanded that the taping be done on Sunday so he could play golf all week. He expected NBC to laugh in his face. Instead, they said yes. The Dean Martin Show became the most subversive brilliance in television history. Because he didn't rehearse, the mistakes became the show. When he flubbed a line, he didn't cut, he laughed. When a door didn't open, he made a joke about the cheap set. He invited the audience into the process. He dismantled the artifice of television live on air. America fell in love with him all over again because he was the only man on TV who wasn't trying to impress them. He was just hanging out. He would slide down the fireman's pole, straighten his tie, and look at the camera with that heavy-lidded gaze that said, "Can you believe they pay me for this?" The celebrity guests, Frank Sinatra, Orson Welles, John Wayne, were terrified. They were used to rehearsals, to blocking, to perfection. Dean would walk up to them, pat them on the cheek, and say, "Don't worry, Pally, just read the cards." He reduced the biggest stars in the world to supporting players in his living room. It was the ultimate power move, disguised as laziness. But while the camera captured the easygoing host, the reality off-camera was becoming increasingly hermetic. You cannot talk about Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra without talking about the other family. The Chicago outfit. The boys with the broken noses and the silk suits. Frank Sinatra loved the mob. He loved the danger, the power, the idea of being a tough guy. He courted their favor. Dean knew them from the cradle. He grew up in Steubenville dealing cards to them. He knew they weren't romantic figures, they were businessmen who killed people. Dean's approach to the mob was the same as his approach to Hollywood, polite detachment. He would shake the hands, he would play the gigs they asked him to play, but he never sat at the table. He never owed them a favor. There is a terrifying story from the Sands era. A high-ranking mob boss wanted Dean to have a drink with him after the show. Dean was tired. He said no. The boss insisted. Dean said no again and went to his room. Frank would have gone. Frank would have stayed up all night to prove his loyalty. Dean went to sleep. The mob boss was furious, but he did nothing. Why? Because Dean didn't fear them, and he didn't need them. You can't leverage a man who wants nothing. This detachment extended to his own family. He was married to the beautiful Jean Beager, the love of his life, the mother of his children. But even Jean couldn't breach the wall. Dean would come home from the studio, retreat to his den, and turn on the TV. He would sit there for hours, watching Gunsmoke or Bonanza, eating a sandwich, drinking milk. Not whiskey. Milk. At parties in his own Beverly Hills mansion, filled with the Hollywood elite, Dean would often disappear. Jean would find him upstairs in the master bedroom, or sometimes even hiding in a closet, watching a portable TV. "There are too many people down there," he would say. The man who could command a stadium of 20,000 people was terrified of small talk. He was an introvert trapped in the life of an extrovert. He gave the world everything he had on stage, and when he came home, he was empty. A shell. There was only one person who could truly light up the darkness in Dean Martin's eyes. His son, Dean Paul Martin. They called him Dino. Dino was the golden child. He was everything Dean was, but without the scars of Steubenville. He was handsome, athletic, talented. He was a tennis pro, a musician, an actor. But more than that, he was a captain in the Air National Guard. He flew F-4 Phantom jets. For Dean, looking at Dino was like looking at a perfected version of himself. A version that didn't have to deal cards in a smoky basement. A version that flew above the clouds, pure and untouched. Dean worshipped the boy. When they were together, the mask dropped. Dean would laugh, a real, belly-shaking laugh. He would talk. He would engage. Dino was the proof that the struggle was worth it. All the humiliating years in cheap clubs, the grind of the road, the nonsense of Hollywood, it was all worth it because it bought Dino a life of freedom. Dean's legacy wasn't the songs or the movies, it was his son. As the 1970s wore on, the world began to change again. The variety show format died. The Rat Pack was ancient history. Frank was retiring and unretiring, desperate to stay relevant. Dean just stopped. He divorced Jean in 1973. It was a shock to the public, but those close to him knew it was inevitable. You can only live with a ghost for so long before you get lonely. Dean moved into a smaller house. He went to restaurants alone. The drunk act became less of a joke and more of a shield against a world he no longer understood. He was still performing, still filling showrooms in Vegas, but the spark was dimming. He was going through the motions. The tuxedo was starting to look like a costume from a bygone era. But he was okay. He had his golf. He had his westerns. And he had Dino. As long as Dino was flying, Dean was grounded. Fate is a cruel writer. It builds you up just to see how far you can fall. March 1987. Dean is 69 years old. He is looking forward to a quiet retirement. The phone rings. Dino Jr.'s jet had vanished off the radar during a routine training exercise in the San Gorgonio Mountains. A snowstorm. For days, they searched. Dean sat in his chair, staring at the telephone, not moving, not speaking, barely breathing. He was back in the ring, taking the hardest punch of his life, waiting for the bell that wouldn't ring. When they found the wreckage, there were no survivors. At that moment, Dean Martin died. The body kept walking, the heart kept beating, but the man, the soul, the wit, the spark, was extinguished on the side of that mountain. At the funeral, Dean stood by the grave, looking older and smaller than anyone had ever seen him. Frank Sinatra was there, holding his arm, trying to be the strong one. But Dean wasn't there. He was looking into the void. He reportedly turned to a friend and whispered, "That's it. It's over." He wasn't talking about the funeral. He was talking about his life. After Dino Jr. died, Dean Martin didn't just grieve, he eroded. It was as if the gravity holding his persona together had suddenly increased tenfold. He lost weight. The handsome, rugged face that had charmed millions became gaunt, the lines around his mouth deepening into canyons of sorrow. But Hollywood, and specifically Frank Sinatra, didn't understand the nature of Dean's silence. Frank operated on a different fuel. For Frank, the cure for pain was work. The cure for silence was noise. Frank had a grand idea. The Together Again tour. It was to be the triumphant return of the Rat Pack, minus Joey Bishop and Peter Lawford. Frank, Dean, and Sammy Davis Jr. taking over the stadiums of America. Frank thought he was saving Dean. He thought that if he could just get Dean back under the lights, back in front of the adoring crowds, the life would return to his eyes. He was wrong. The tour began in Oakland, March 1988. It was a disaster from the first downbeat. Sammy was dying of throat cancer, though he hid it with a manic energy that was painful to watch. Frank was aggressive, controlling, barking orders at the orchestra, desperate to recreate the magic of 1960. And Dean? Dean was a ghost. He would walk onto the stage, and the crowd would scream, desperate for the king of cool. But the man standing there wasn't cool, he was numb. He flicked his cigarette ash not with style, but with a tremor. He forgot lyrics, not as a joke this time, but because he simply didn't care to remember them. He looked at Frank running around the stage, sweating and straining for applause, and he looked at Sammy destroying his body for one last ovation, and Dean realized something profound: it's all dust. The breaking point came in Chicago. The Star Plaza Theater. The atmosphere backstage was toxic. Frank was furious at Dean's lack of effort. He couldn't understand why Dean wouldn't snap out of it. He didn't understand that Dean didn't want to snap out of it, he wanted to live in it. On stage, during a duet, Dean stopped singing. The orchestra hesitated. The audience tittered nervously, waiting for the punchline. Dean looked at Frank. For decades, Dean had played the sidekick, the easygoing pal who let Frank be the boss. But in that moment, the hierarchy dissolved. Dean Martin, the steelworker's son, looked at the chairman of the board with eyes that were ancient and tired. He leaned into the microphone. The venue was silent. "I want to go home," he said. It wasn't a bit. It wasn't a setup for a song. It was a plea. He didn't mean the hotel. He didn't mean Beverly Hills. He meant he wanted to leave the circus. He wanted to take off the mask. Frank tried to laugh it off, tried to bully him back into the act. But Dean dropped the microphone, not a mic drop of triumph, but of surrender. He walked off the stage. He went to his dressing room, changed out of the tuxedo for the last time on a tour, got on a plane, and flew back to Los Angeles. He left Frank. He left the tour. He left the millions of dollars on the table. It was the ultimate act of defiance. The world demanded his soul, and he said, no. The last 7 years of Dean Martin's life are often described as sad, but that is a misunderstanding. They were quiet. For a man who had lived in the center of a hurricane for 40 years, quiet was a luxury. He established a routine. Every evening, he would put on a blazer and slacks, always well-dressed, never sloppy, and drive his sports car to his favorite Italian restaurant, La Famiglia or Da Vinci's, in Beverly Hills. He would arrive early, before the dinner rush. The staff adored him. They knew the drill. They would seat him in the back booth, away from the door, away from the eyes. He would order the same thing, pasta fagioli, a little bread, a glass of red wine. And he would sit there alone. Sometimes, fans would spot him. They would whisper, "Is that Dean Martin?" They would expect to see a entourage, showgirls, a party. Instead, they saw a frail old man eating soup in silence. Some tried to approach him. "Hey Dino. Have a drink with us." He would look up, offer a polite, faint smile, and gently wave them away. He had given them 50 years of his life, he felt he didn't owe them his dinner. He wasn't lonely, he was solitary. There is a difference. He was finally spending time with the only person he had ever truly trusted, himself. He spent his days watching westerns on TV, the volume turned up loud as his hearing faded. He loved the simplicity of the cowboys. Good guys, bad guys, a horse, a gun, and the open range. No critics, no contracts, no tragedies. Just the sunset. The irony of the universe is poetic. The man whose voice is the soundtrack to Christmas, Let It Snow, Winter Wonderland, Marshmallow World, began to fade as the holiday approached in 1995. His lungs, battered by a lifetime of cigarettes, the one vice that was real, were failing. He refused heroic measures. He didn't want machines. He didn't want a spectacle. He lay in his bed at his home in Beverly Hills. The street outside was quiet, lined with palm trees wrapped in Christmas lights. On the morning of December 25, 1995, Christmas Day, Dean Martin took his last breath. The news traveled across the world instantly. But the most poignant tribute didn't come from the White House or the studios. It happened in Las Vegas. That night, the Strip went dark. The neon lights of the Sands, the Flamingo, the Caesar's Palace, lights that are designed to never turn off, were cut. For 10 minutes, the brightest street on earth was plunged into darkness. The gambling stopped. The slot machines went silent. The music died. It was the city bowing its head. It was Las Vegas admitting that without the man who made it cool, it was just a pile of light bulbs in the desert. So, what remains? When we look back at the 20th century, we see icons who tried to change the world. Sinatra tried to conquer it. Elvis tried to shock it. The Beatles tried to heal it. Dean Martin just tried to survive it. He taught us that cool isn't about sunglasses or cigarettes. It's about armor. It's about the ability to walk through a fire without sweating, not because you aren't burned, but because you refuse to give the fire the satisfaction of seeing you flinch. He fooled us all. We thought he was the drunkard, the clown, the lucky guy who fell upwards. But he was the smartest man in the room. He knew that fame was a rental, that applause was just noise, and that in the end, we all end up back in Steubenville, in the dark, alone with our thoughts. The next time you pour a drink, make it apple juice. Raise it to the glass. Look into the amber liquid and realize that things are rarely what they seem. And if you listen closely, underneath the orchestra and the laughter, you can still hear him. The King of Silence. Finally home.